Good afternoon. For our next session, I'm pleased to introduce a fireside chat on geopolitics and cyber warfare, featuring David Sanger, White House and national security correspondent and senior writer for the New York Times, and Tom Burt, corporate vice president of customer security and trust at the Microsoft Corporation. In addition to his nearly 4-decade-long career with the New York Times, David is also a New York Times best-selling author. His latest book is titled The Perfect Weapon: War, Sabotage, and Fear in the Cyber Age. Tom's role focuses on sustaining trust between Microsoft and its customers by ensuring that all the company's products and online service offerings are protected from threats. Tom advocates for cybersecurity policies domestically and abroad. He has been with Microsoft since 1995. We'll have 30 minutes for this session, and as a reminder, if time permits, we'll be taking audience questions. Please submit your questions via Pigeonhole so our moderators will be able to see them. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for that introduction. It's great to be back at George Washington, and a real pleasure to be here with my old friend Tom Burt. I can tell you, as a reporter who has worked in this territory for a while, when I am confused, which is just about all the time, or when I am trying to sort out conflicting statements by people in the US government, which is about 80% of the time, I will frequently call Tom, and we will have a conversation to sort out what he is seeing, because the Microsoft network is so wide and so vast that frequently they see things before the US intelligence community does, and are frequently the best source of understanding of where geopolitical events are unfolding. So Tom, let me jump right in and start you with the question I get asked the most. When the war in Ukraine began, many people expected that it would be first and foremost a cyber war, that Kyiv would go dark, that basically that the Russian approach would be to turn the city off. They didn't do that. We got something that looked for a while more like World War II, and that today looks a lot like World War I. I mean, we're back to trench warfare. But there's also a significant cyber war underway. It's just we don't see it as often. Tell us what you've seen and how it's changed.
So we actually saw the cyber war begin the day before the tanks rolled across the borders and missile launched, which was February 24th. It was on February 23rd that Russia launched a major cyber attack against government and private sector organizations in Ukraine, utilizing custom wiper malware, that once they got it into a network, it would work its way through the network and basically wipe out all the data on those devices and effectively brick the network that it was attacking. One of the things that Microsoft has done for many years is we notify customers when we see them threatened or compromised by a nation-state actor. And that's really how we got engaged with Ukraine the month before, when we saw a small incursion like that. And so since that time, since the 23rd of February, we've been providing threat intelligence directly, and it's, for various reasons, it's passing through me. So I am providing threat intelligence that we come up with from our technical threat hunting team that you know well, that we call the Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center, or MYSTIC. And that team hunts nation-state actors. They provide the threat intelligence to me. I've been providing it in an encrypted channel to cybersecurity officials in Ukraine, and that's been 24/7, 365 since the beginning of the war. And what we saw at the outset was a very large and very significant of a number of attacks targeting all these different agencies using wiper malware. But between the work that we'd done, the work Ukraine had done to prepare for resilience, the ability that we had to notify them so they could either identify the attack while it was underway and stop it, or recover from it more quickly, just like the kinetic war, which was intended to surround Kyiv and cause regime change within a week or two, the cyber war was not any more effective than the kinetic war during those first couple of weeks. And then we saw a retrenchment of the cyber attacks as they reset strategy. And then after that, until recently, we've seen an ongoing series of cyber attacks, often targeting the same sectors of the Ukraine government or economy that we saw being attacked in a kinetic way. So, for example, attacks against logistics and transportation companies, or attacks against the water utilities, which we saw being targeted by kinetic attacks as well. And then as we got into the fall, and it was well documented that the kinetic attacks were targeting the provision of energy to the citizens of Ukraine, we saw the same thing happening in the cyberspace, where there were ongoing wiper attacks against the energy sector. But that's been at a lower volume, but a tactical volume that was clearly coordinated with what they were doing with the kinetic operations as well. Now, in the last three to 4 weeks, we've seen a resurgence in the volume of cyber attacks that's been occurring in Ukraine. But instead of being destructive wiper attacks, the attacks we're seeing right now are intended to get access to the targeted networks. And they're all networks that have some military association in some way. And they're within Ukraine. They're also across Europe, UK, and the US. A significant increase in these either espionage and intelligence gathering attacks, or they could be pre-positioning themselves in a network for future destructive attacks, and they are waiting their time to actually launch that attack.
I'm going to come back to that in a moment, Tom, but your point on the coordination between the military attacks and the kinetic attacks and the cyber attacks is a really interesting one. You know, you and I talked a lot when I was working on The Perfect Weapon about the analogy with air war. You know, there were people who thought prior to World War I, we would have air war with airplanes. And we used airplanes some in World War I. They weren't terribly decisive. But between World War I and World War II, people figured out how to connect these up, integrate the air power. That resulted in us being able to not only take more territory, but drop the atom bomb, for better or worse, probably worse. Do you feel, as you are watching this conflict break out and proceed, that we are at a similar point in the cyber world where the Russians are still struggling to integrate how they're using cyber with missile attacks, artillery, and so forth?
You know, I'm not sure I would say that they're struggling to figure out how to integrate it, because we did see this close coordination pattern consistently over, many months of the war. But I do think the thing that was surprising to us, and a lesson that we've learned from this, I think we all expected that the Russians would have a warehouse of cyber weapons, destructive malware, that they would bring to bear against their targets. And that really hasn't proven to be true. They had this custom wiper malware, and I think they thought it was going to work. But we were actually able to help defeat that in several ways, including what we called some technical countermeasures that we provided and helped push onto machines across Ukraine to help stop this wiper malware from being successful. And instead of bringing some new form of weapon, the Russians just evolved the existing wiper malware. They're actually on the 10th generation of their wiper malware. As we work with Ukraine to help them defeat the wipers, they evolve it to try to make it more effective. Now, what we've seen most recently, starting last October, is that they're developing ransomware, or what looks like ransomware. It's really intended, again, to be a destructive weapon, but it works as ransomware does, and it posts a ransom note, and it calls itself something like ransomware often does. The one last October they called Prestige. They have a new one they call Sullivan. And these ransomware packages will encrypt the target data so it's useless, claim that it's ransomware, and if you pay some Bitcoin, they'll give you the key, but they have no intent of ever giving you the key because it's not to get money, it's to shut down these attacks. And we saw them using that against logistics companies in Ukraine, and also one against in Poland, which is the only time since the war began that we've seen the Russians engaging in a destructive attack outside Ukraine.
That's a really interesting point. So the Polish one was really, if I recall correctly from our own reporting and from what you were learning, it was against delivery systems, delivery networks that were delivering the weapons across the border into Ukraine, the Western weapons. So you can understand why they would think this was an extension of the battlefield. But what you are suggesting here is that just as Putin has been cautious about not launching kinetic attacks across the border that could strike NATO nations and bring NATO into the war, they have been equally cautious in the cyber arena.
That's right. And you know well the NotPetya attack, which we attributed, and I think all the cybersecurity community attributed to a Russian actor associated with Russian GRU. That same actor that developed that destructive malware that was initially targeted at Ukraine is the same actor that's been behind all of the destructive malware that we've seen used during the Ukraine war.
We should remind people NotPetya was against Ukrainian targets in 2017, and yet it took out FedEx and Maersk, and it had a lot of collateral damage to it beyond Ukraine's borders.
That's right, and that's because that malware was wormable, which means it would move across the internet to any other vulnerable network that it could find on the internet and then infect that. So it was based on putting malware into the update package for a Ukrainian accounting software that was popular in Ukraine. But it turned out there were multinationals operating in Ukraine, and their Ukrainian subsidiary used that package. They got infected. It was wormable, and it moved outside of those networks and in effect, crossed the border outside Ukraine. Wormable attacks like that, you can't really control once you launch them. And that's why it's been interesting to see that the malware that they've used in Ukraine has been destructive, but not wormable. So they could attack a particular network and know they were going to stay in that network.
A lesson many learned from Stuxnet Forward, the US and Israeli attack on the Iranian centrifuges that spread out across and around the world. Mm-hmm. Let's talk for one moment before we turn to China and some other regions. Talk for a moment about one disturbing thing that we have seen in the Russian possible preparations for moving outside of Ukraine in coming months. If the war turns bad, if Putin determines that his military is irredeemable and he's going to have to turn to cyber, chemical, bio, or nuclear along the way. In the Discord documents, which since I don't have a security clearance, I could read. You do, so you've probably avoided them if you possibly could. But in the Discord documents, there was an interesting reference to the implant of Russian, mostly criminal software in the Canadian gas pipeline system. This is just within the past couple of months, because the Discord documents are basically all from mid-late February through to March, so forth. If you took the face value of what was in the reporting in that document, it said that this was a Russian criminal group that was being controlled by a suspected FSB officer. And that the instructions were simply wait for instructions. Now, of course, in these documents, you just get like a view through a straw. But as we've reported it around, people have said, yeah, we've seen other things like that. And before Ukraine, we saw things like that, including the very public Russian efforts to get inside the US electric grid. So what's going on here? Should we think about this as just the normal stuff that Russian criminal groups do every day in wartime and in peacetime? Or should we think about this as preparation for the day when Putin says, okay, I've had it with these sanctions, we're going to make the Americans or the Canadians or the British or someone pay a price?
Well, it's certainly a technique that we've seen Russian actors use for some time, is to pre-position themselves in a network, even if they have no intelligence gathering or data exfiltration plan, but they want to get into a network, potentially to pre-position for a destructive attack. And as you mentioned, that seems to be what's going on with this gas pipeline in Canada. And it's certainly been a concern of the national security community in the US that our critical infrastructure, a lot of which relies upon very old and outdated software systems, could be vulnerable to that kind of an attack. And if you think about that, if you were Russia, you would want to pre-position in your targets, but keep your powder dry until the moment that you actually want to launch the attack. So this is just an example that sort of proves that that risk is a real risk, even though we don't have any particular intelligence to suggest from what we've seen that there is anything like that going on in the US, with the exception of, I mentioned this big run-up that we've seen in the last few weeks, where we're not seeing destructive activity, but we can't yet tell if the purpose of all of those new efforts is to gather intelligence and information or to pre-position for possible escalation of destructive cyber attacks, both inside and outside Ukraine, because a lot of this activity has been happening in Europe, UK, and the US, not just Ukraine. So it's possible that there's that risk. And certainly those of us in the cybersecurity world have felt for some time that the next most likely escalation, should Russia choose to escalate outside Ukraine, would be cyber escalation, because it's not considered in general to be as reprehensible as a military operation might be viewed. And I think there's an open issue as to whether those kinds of attacks outside Ukraine would necessarily trigger, I think it's Article 5 of NATO, that is effectively cause NATO to then have to respond.
Right, and NATO has never yet declared Article 5 on a cyber-related issue. They've only declared Article 5 once. It was on 9/11. Let's talk for a moment about other areas of the world where we're seeing very active cyber war. One that strikes me the most is Israel-Iran these days.
Absolutely. They're engaged in an ongoing destructive cyber war where they launch cyber attacks at one another, sometimes coordinated with or responded to with a kinetic attack. We've seen a cyber attack responded to with a missile and vice versa, mostly from Iran towards Israel. It's been cyber, but that is just an ongoing cyber war. And we've also seen Iran now engaging in destructive cyber attacks against Albania. And that's all been in response to Albania harboring a group called MEK, which is a dissident group that is engaged in information operations and propaganda operations in Iran. And so, we see another nation state willing to use cyber attacks to cause destruction and disruption in another nation state. So it's worrisome because now you see this. We saw in 2017 the two big attacks, right? There was not Petra, there was WannaCry, that was the North Koreans, that both caused quite a bit of economic destruction. In the case of WannaCry, put some human health at risk, although no real clear case of a human being harmed by it, but they were certainly put at risk because shutdown of the national health system in England and other impacts. Then things got quiet again. There were those two big attacks and we didn't see destructive attacks. But now we have this ongoing cyber war in Ukraine. We've got Israel and Iran and Albania. And it just leads to sort of the anticipation of cyber weapons being used more frequently in nation-state conflict.
So, and I should say here, because it's a topic Tom and I talk about a lot offline, which is what's interesting about the four nations that he described, Russia, North Korea, Iran, we can add China where we're about to go turn, is that there is right now this sort of loose alliance of the aggrieved, right? We've got China actively courting Russia, a relationship the United States tried to stop from coming together back to Nixon and Kissinger to China. You've got the North Koreans making some hard currency when they're not doing cryptocurrency thefts and so forth by selling arms to, mostly ammunition rounds, to Russia. Of course, Iran is providing drones to Russia, and it's not clear what they're getting in return. So all of the four major cyber actors are coming together geopolitically, not only in opposition to the US, but with some common goals. Now, they've each got tensions between themselves, but it's a moment where I think you're going to see the cyber world and the kinetic world sort of join.
Certainly possible and threatening, right? And you mentioned North Korea and their cryptocurrency theft. North Korea, that's been a key component of their cyber activity for a decade or more, because they started off with the SWIFT bank attacks where they were stealing money from the process by which banks exchange funds between one another, and they were very successful at that. The banks increased cybersecurity, and now they're going after the crypto exchanges and a number of different creative approaches to stealing crypto money. They've gotten hundreds of millions of dollars over the last year or so in those attacks, which is directly going to fund their missile program.
So in the past, we always looked at the Chinese cyber program as something of a way for them to get to the theft of intellectual property here in the United States. You certainly had a China problem with your Microsoft Exchange servers a few years ago. Today, we're more fascinated by Chinese influence operations. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, this comes back to our experience in Ukraine as well, where Russia has combined three different zones of operation. We've talked about kinetic, we've talked about cyber and their destructive attacks. But in addition to that, Russia has been very active in their influence operations, their spread of propaganda and messaging, and they're doing that around the world. And they have built an incredible network in over 40 languages, almost encompassing the entire globe, that they use to spread their propaganda messages through both online media outlets and conventional media outlets. There are many countries in the world where our data shows that Russian state-controlled media is the most highly consumed source of media and of news. And they do that by having local language, quality local journalism, and then their nation-state propaganda is worked into that messaging. And when you think about that, that's frightening, because the source of media you consume, if you read the New York Times regularly, that's because you trust the New York Times, as you should. But you trust the New York Times. If you listen,
I don't pay him till later. Yeah.
No, I mean, and if you watch Fox News regularly, that's because you trust Fox News to present you, fair and balanced news, whether you believe that's true or not. And so it's true in many of these countries that there are many countries, probably way more than not, that if you had them vote in the United Nations, do the people of your country believe that Russia's war with Ukraine is justified? The answer would be yes, because they have heard and believe the Russian messaging about why they are in this war. They're very effective at it. What we've seen now over the last couple of years is China has been investing heavily in their influence operations as well. In a similar number of countries, similar number of languages, they have a slightly different strategy, which is that they are using quite effectively, which is they basically pay internet influencers, social media influencers, to include their propaganda messages in their influence, in their social media posts. And a lot of these are people, are members of the Chinese diaspora. Some of them we think are pretend members of the diaspora, but they're actually working out of Beijing. Many of them are young women that have, 1 million plus followers, and they talk about fashion or music or cinema or whatever their hook is to have built their audience. They're now being hired by intelligence operations out of China to spread Chinese propaganda as part of
Do
that.
they know that they're being hired to do that?
In those cases, we think yes. Yes, they know they're being hired, they know they're being paid, and they know that they're being asked to spread these particular messages as part of what they are communicating to their followers. And so that's a technique, but it's one of many techniques. And that's the important thing is when you chart out the networks, whether it's Russia or China, the networks that they're using to spread their nation state messages, they are complex, multimodal, and highly, highly effective. And it's a way, in which the authoritarian governments of the world have a disproportionate advantage over Western democracies because they have state-controlled media. They can invest in these kinds of resources in a way that the West simply doesn't do. And it gives them this asymmetrical advantage in that zone of nation-state conflict, which is what it's become.
So what you and I have discussed recent times as we've been trying to think about AI and its effects here, you've made the point to me that you think AI for disinformation purposes will favor the authoritarian states for the reasons you just said. But you're hopeful that it may also help defeat ordinary destructive cyber attacks. Tell us why.
Yeah, I'm actually very optimistic that AI is going to continue to provide the defenders with an asymmetric advantage. And we're seeing that already. We've seen AI algorithms that we have in a product we call Defender for Endpoint. We had a customer in Ukraine. That product had an algorithm that detected this code that was trying to establish itself in their network. And the algorithm said, this code is misbehaving. It's suspicious. We're going to not allow it to be installed and warn you that it's coming in. That kind of AI is going to develop rapidly over the coming years. It's going to become more effective. It's going to recognize code that's up to no good and be able to block it much more effectively and frequently. We're doing some things.
And it's doing so because previously you were looking backward. If you had a library of past attacks, you would recognize it, but a new attack would frequently slip through. What you're describing is a way to sort of have a pattern recognition that something is amiss, even if the system isn't sure what that something is.
Right, it's never seen it. What Dave is talking about is antivirus software works by, once a malware attack has happened and you've identified the malware, you reverse engineer it and you create what's called a signature that recognizes that specific malware. That goes into antivirus software, ours and our competitors' antivirus software. The antivirus companies actually share this stuff through a communications channel, a virus total place where we post this information so that we can all build better antivirus software. But it's always after the fact. And all an attacker has to do is make a modest change to their code and it defeats that signature until you create a new signature. What I'm talking about are algorithms that actually can inspect and see that the operation of the code, whether it's got a signature for it or not, is suspicious. It looks like it's up to no good. And we will be able to use the data. Microsoft gets 65 trillion signals every day that come in from our global ecosystem. Now, not all of those are useful for this purpose, but a lot of it is. The data scientists would say it all is. And we will continue to build more advanced AI that's going to recognize this and be able to stop it and block it. We're doing some really cool stuff right now to be able to help people stop getting phished, which is still the main way that attackers, whether they're nation state attackers or cyber criminals, it's one of the principal tools they use to get in. So I have a lot, and the key thing here is these AI systems, like the OpenAI ChatGPT systems that have been in the headlines so much recently, they take unbelievable capital investment in order to simply create the supercomputer that those systems are trained on. That's part of our partnership with OpenAI, is we built that supercomputer that they trained these things on. It costs billions of dollars to create these supercomputers. It then costs an incredible amount of money and takes a ton of infrastructure to actually operate those systems, even once they've been created. And so the number of private sector entities in the world that will have both the technical capability and the resources to do that is limited. Same thing with governments. If you look across the zone of cybercrime and most nation-state activity, there's going to be an asymmetrical advantage to the US, where we and Google and AWS are all based, and to the Western governments that can afford to work on this, and China. China is going to be there for sure. But that significantly reduces the scope of the risk once these AI algorithms get there. On the other hand, AI can also be used to refine communications, to create much more accurate and influential messaging in multiple languages, and do it rapidly and pull information together. And so we will see those kinds of AI engines used by the bad guys as much as by the good guys to create messaging and to communicate and have influence.
Well, Tom, I've got a list of more topics for you, and a few have come in as well, but I'm afraid that while we are not out of topics, we are out of time. So I want to thank you very much for this discussion, and I want to thank all of you for joining us today, and thanks to Tom.
Thank you all.